The public has a long-held fascination with detectives. Detectives see a side of life the average person is never exposed to. In this podcast series, I Catch Killers with Gary Jubilant, I will be interviewing real detectives, taking the audience into their world, a world that is rarely seen by the public. I spent 34 years as a cop. For 25 of those years, I was catching killers. That's what I did for a living. I was a homicide detective. I'm no longer interviewing bad guys, instead I'm interviewing detectives. The guests I've selected are the cops I consider real detectives. Their business was catching bad guys, and they were prepared to go into a world where pressure, risk and sacrifice was the norm. These are their stories. Welcome back to part 2 of my chat with retired Detective Inspector Dennis O'Toole. Today, we'll be talking about the international manhunt to catch the killers of heart surgeon Victor Chang and the fascinating case involving the famous Walters boxing family. Hope you enjoy my second part of the chat with Dennis O'Toole. As homicide detectives, we do a lot of murders around the state. I did a murder, I've done a few murders up at Hunter Valley. And don't look over at your mate Barry to defend yourself here. Why are you the most popular? I was going to say detective, but I'd take it even further. You seem to be the most popular human being in the Hunter Valley. Just so the listeners understand what I'm talking about here, when we do a murder in the Hunter Valley, when we're based in Sydney, we'll live up there and stay in pubs or whatever. Everywhere I went in the Hunter Valley, and you had obviously cleared the path before, everyone said, "Oh, you're a detective. Do you know Miles? Do you know Miles?" You'd go to the barman, you'd just order a beer. You wouldn't even declare who you are. And they go, "Oh, do you know Dennis?" How did you become so popular in the Hunter Valley?
Oh, I think you're confusing me with somebody else. We had... I have no knowledge of what you're talking about.
You
there.
deny that allegation. You're not popular.
No, I don't think it was me, but there was a murder up there of a local identity who was really well known. He was an old magician, and he was known far and wide out in the coal fields and what have you, and he was brutally hacked to death up there. And Detective Sergeant Alex Pollock and myself were investigating that, and probably it came about the type of people that are up there. It's a very closed shop, a very closed community.
Yeah.
And I'd never experienced this where you were talking to 18-year-olds or 80-year-olds and they'd say, "No, don't know." I said, one of your own's been brutally murdered. Don't you want to... We're being taught never to talk to the cops. Right? You never And it came back to a police shooting at Rothbury, at a mine at Rothbury in 1929, and trying to get these people to open up and at least converse with detectives in particular. I mean, the local uniformed blokes probably not a problem, but to get any of them to talk to you, even about one of their own. And that's what I'd say. Look, one of your own. Don't you want to help find the people that did this or the person that did this? No, we're being taught you don't talk to the cops, and you blokes have got a job to do, that's fine. But so we tried to go about it with a nice way and
break down the barriers.
And go and meet them in a pub or a club or something. And
you left an indelible impression. I didn't see it, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a statue of you built in Hunter Valley. I don't know what you did. I'm not even going to ask that. We don't have to go there. But that's another part. And we talk about the heavy parts and the impact that homicide investigation or the life of a detective has, but we get to see different worlds, don't we?
You are. You're in a different world. And I'm not trying to downplay it or what have you. That this is serious, and it's a fact of life that there are bad people out there that are going to commit horrific things, and it's up to us to prevent that happening again. It's happened. You can't do anything about that. So you've just got to do your best to make certain whoever committed that offence is not going to do it again. Put them away and protect the decent members of the community.
And I like your honesty in saying that when you are investigating a crime, there's a bit of ego in that you don't want to be beaten. I think that's a trait that detectives, you've got to have some pride in what you do, and it's almost a challenge. If someone's been murdered and you're the person responsible for catching that person, there is a challenge there. So
it's a challenge.
Yeah,
As you mentioned before, there's been a few challenges that I've done, but again, I haven't done them by myself.
Oh no! It's one thing that I think people need to understand, that policing is a team sport, and
what it is.
Yeah, you'll have the captain or the person that is recognised for it, but I fully understand, as you say, with the granny killer, 70 people on that, and
I've been very fortunate. I've had great workmates. I've had mentors, I suppose you would call them, senior police that you look up to, that were, again, totally committed to what they did, and you learn so much from it. We sort of broke new ground I was at North Sydney, and I was working, my workmate there was a policewoman. She was a great person, but on this particular occasion we caught a fellow. There'd been an assault, and we stopped this bloke in the street, and he was a witness, and he was telling us, he was very helpful, really nice bloke. So we'll take him back to the office and get a statement off him while we can. Whatever. When we got him back to the office, and the detective's office at North Sydney was distinct from the police station, 100 yards or so away. So we went up there late at night, got him in there. As I'm starting to talk to him, all of a sudden, he wasn't a witness. This was the boy we were after.
Right.
And he realised that that was, all of a sudden, he's in trouble. So he jumps up, he tried to make a bolt for the door, and he didn't.
Yeah.
I've grabbed him, and we're like two wildcats. We're middle of the night in this deserted office, and the policewoman I was with raced out of the office, outside to the main office, and I thought, it flashed through my mind, thanks for the help, sort of thing. What I didn't know was that she went straight to the phone, called for assistance straight away, and raced back in, and by that stage, we'd knocked over tables and chairs. I've got to be honest, he was under the table, and I'm jamming him in with a chair because he was on top of me at the time, and he jumped up, pulled himself from under the table, and he's come at me thrashing, I'm thrashing, and all I remember is seeing a handbag being swung like that, and that instant I thought, bloody handbag, what good is that? Then I heard the thump, because she had a 38 in the handbag, hit him on the side of the head.
38 revolvers are pretty heavy, even in a handbag.
Knocked him down, he's lying down there, and she said, I haven't heard him. And she said, I forgot that was in there.
I think we've all had those moments in policing when you're actually wrestling with an offender, and it seems like an out-of-body experience, doesn't it? You're just going, and I'm getting paid for this.
Especially when you're losing.
What about, and we won't mention his name for obvious reasons, but I think you actually passed him on to me, and my life has never been the same.
I know who you're talking about.
We'll refer to him as Mr. X,
Mr. X.
Prison informant, just to give people a sense of it. He been charged with murder, but I think he's been pretty well charged with everything. Like, he's a very, very extensive criminal history. I met him on an investigation. We won't name the investigation. He kept dropping, do you know Miles? Do you know Miles? I go, yeah. And so you were his point of reference. Just check with Miles. I'm good. I'm reliable on this. I think that was about 25 years ago, and he's still playing a prominent part in my life. In fact, I got a phone call from a hospital, and I said, why are you phoning me? And they said, because you're down as his next of kin. So I just want to publicly thank you, Miles, for passing that on. How would you describe him?
He was, I've used the word unique, Mr. X. He was a heroin addict, and he turned out to be an incredible informant.
Yes.
And he was worth his weight in gold as an informant.
Yeah.
And I sometimes think if I hadn't done what I've done, which isn't according to Hoyle, but they were in a relationship for a number of years. I don't know to this day.
But there are times in your policing career where you've got to make judgment calls.
Well, I made a decision then.
Yeah, and those judgment calls, like he's assisted me on things. One that wasn't the last time I saw him, but the time before that he happened to be in jail again. Go figure that. That comes as a surprise to you, I'm sure. But I walked into jail and he's dressed in his prison greens, and he came, I won't say running because that's an exaggeration, but walked up to me very fast. We're in the middle of a yard and he's given me a big hug and said, "I love you, brother." And I've gone, as I'm standing there cuddling this 6'4" giant in prison greens in the middle of prison, I said, "I don't think that's a good look for either of us." But that's him.
I know.
So thank you, Miles. I can forward on your contact number to him if you want to renew the relationship.
No, I'll
renege
on that one.
Leave it as that. In the 1980s, the Waters family were well known across Australia. The three brothers, Dean, Guy and Troy, were all Australian champion boxers, trained by their father Cess. On the surface, it looked like a successful feel-good story, but following the murder of Alan Hall in 1988, the dark secrets of the family were revealed. So people that haven't heard of this investigation, it was the Waters brothers had a father, Cess. He was a boxer and he trained his sons in what's now been recognised as a barbaric way. But they rose to become three Australian champion boxers in the one family. They were pretty famous at the time. They were fighting for world titles. And there was a murder of a person by the name of Alan Hall up on the Central Coast, which is sort of 2 hours north of Sydney. A shotgun, was it? It was shotgun. Do you want to just take me through your involvement in that?
Very briefly, Cess and Dean had been charged with the murder of Alan Hall, but it was beaten at the lower court and they were acquitted. It was thrown out. And anyway, it didn't go away, and as you know in a homicide, when you do have a spare minute, you go back over old murders and what have you. I got the brief there and it appeared to me, no doubt, that they were involved. They did. And there was nothing you could do.
Could I just to put in perspective, Alan Hall was suspected of having an affair with Cess's partner?
Well, he wasn't suspected, Jude.
Okay.
What happened, Cess had a number of horses along with 70 dogs on his property, and Alan Hall broke in those horses. He was a horse breaker, amongst other things. And when he had broken in the horses and wanted payment, Cess didn't have any money, so Cess offered him his wife in payment.
Yeah.
So Alan Hall had a sexual relationship with Christine, and they fell in love, basically. So all of a sudden, he treated her totally different to how Cess was. Cess was a brutal, evil man, there's no question of that, with his whole family, with his sons and daughter. He had a daughter, which he would never acknowledge. Once she had left, Christine had left Cess, that was it. The house had been torched where they were living. Again, no charges laid, but it was pretty obvious who did it. And then the shooting. It's, again, very unusual that there was a shotgun used and a .22. Damon Cooper had the .22. Dean had the shotgun. Dean killed Alan Waters with a blast to the chest, and I've got no doubt that what Damon did, Damon closed his eyes, fired, and Alan Hall had a stock whip, and he was cracking the stock whip, and it was actually above his head when he cracked it the last time, and the .22 bullet lodged in the stock whip. So he played no part in his death other than the... But Damon ended up going to jail for 14 years, and Dean beat it on diminished responsibility. But it was an amazing case. What Cess put those boys and girl through, people, I think you'd be hard-pressed to convince people what an evil bugger he was. He treated them like animals. The boys themselves, I think I admire them so much, the whole family. How they came out of it without mental scars is beyond me. But they did.
And the strange thing, until the public became aware, it was almost like, okay, he's a hard-ass father training his sons to be champions. But it was verged on, well, it didn't verge, it was evil.
At one stage I interviewed his daughter, and she was telling me things that had happened, and I'm shaking my head, and you know, this bloke do all this? And she said, well, here you are. She said at high school she ran in a mile race and ran second, and she felt, I ran second, new beauty. Cess came and got her, took her from the sports day, took her home and belted her with a rubber hose for running second. Next time, you'll run first.
Yeah.
She went to bed that night with no dinner or anything like that. The following day, the door opened. She said, I'm in bed, and there's Dad with a hose again. She said, I waited until he came up to the bed. She said, pretending I was asleep. He looked away for an instant. She said, I flew out of bed, out the door. She said, over the veranda, and then she got tangled in a barbed wire fence. And Cess was belting her with the rubber hose.
Yeah.
You'll never run second again. And the boys ran out and pulled him off her.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, Dean and Troy. And I just shook my head, and I'm looking at it, and she said, look. And she undid the blouse and showed me the scars from the barbed wire.
Yeah.
And she said, I had to get out of there, which she did, of course. But he did the same with Dean. Dean was heavyweight champion of Australia, and he belittled Dean unbelievably. I could tell you stories which we can't put in a family magazine. Yeah. He was a terrible man.
Yeah, I know it's had an impact on you and anyone that had a look into that world, what those the kids were put through.
Jaco, Paul and I, we went up and I said, let's go and stir him up. We've got a complaint here from the ex-wife. We'll use that as a pretext.
Okay, so this is after Cess had been charged and acquitted, and Dean had been charged and acquitted. You've had a look at it with Jaco,
a number of years later.
And a quiet moment in homicide, so you pick up an old case, you've had a look at it and go, they're good for it.
Let's run with it.
Let's run for it. So you've reached out to Dean. So that's where we're at now.
And the three boys were in a room at the house, told them we were coming over Christine, the allegations. And we were sitting down, Paul and I, opposite them, and we spoke about Christine and allegations and all this. And then I just threw a curly one straight at Dean. I said, I want to talk about Alan Hall.
Yeah.
Well, you should have seen the look on Dean's face.
Yes.
And I asked a number of questions, and he wouldn't look me in the eye. He would not look at me. And we spoke about it for a while. The boys wouldn't look.
Yep.
And I said, anyway, see how we go, Dean. Walked out, jumped in the car. Jaco said, he did it. I said, we'll keep on this. Now, rang him a number of times, called out and saw him a number of times. He wouldn't admit it. He wouldn't look me in the eye, but he never once denied it. And never once
very telling.
Did he say, I don't want to speak to you, don't come, anything else. So that was in the state of limbo. Next thing, it all went quiet and we had murders and that was it. I did something with Dean I have never done to anybody outside of the police in my life. I gave him my silent phone number, home phone number. And I said, look, if you ever want to talk about it, and I could see he wanted to. He just couldn't bring himself to do it. I said, you ring me, anytime you ring me. I've never done that with anybody else, and probably quite a few police will frown and tut-tut. But cut a long story short, I got a phone call one night from Melbourne. He was in Melbourne, Dean, and he'd been there for a while. He told me that he was in with a bad crew and he wanted to come and see me. And he said, you know what I want to see you about?
Yeah.
Do it. 2 days later, his solicitor rang me, and 2 days after that, presented himself to the detective's office at Gosford, and he admitted the whole thing.
Full confession.
And from our perspective, our point of view, what he didn't know was that we'd been working on Cess for a number of months. Yeah. We had an informant who was Cess's best friend, and that informant was wired up.
Right.
We had listening device licence, we had warrants to do it, all legal, what have you, and Cess was Skyting to this acquaintance. We had all that tape, and what Dean wasn't aware of was the things he was telling us just corroborated all the stuff in the tapes. And anyway, that it was just gold as far as we were concerned for evidence. But the one thing that jumps out at me, the night that Alan Hall was murdered, the previous night they'd been practising with a .22 firing out of Cess's lounge room, the window. That was the night before the murder. Yep. The night of the murder, the police arrived at Cess's place because he was the obvious suspect. But Cess at that time had something like 70 odd dogs there, among other things, and the dogs were in the house.
And just so the public fully understand what we're talking about here, 70 or odd dogs, and they'd go to the toilet in the house.
They'd go to the toilet in the house, yes, amongst other places.
Yeah.
And as the police are banging on the door and opening up, Cess has looked around, and Cess saw a 22 shell casing on the floor.
Yeah.
And being the cunning rat that he was, he realised if that was to match with the shell casing that had been found, or had been found, he didn't know that, but there was evidence, he knew that. He picked it up and put it in his mouth as the police walked in the front door. And what he did do was tell our informant, who was wired up with a tape, that the unfortunate part of that was that he picked it up with a piece of dog excrement, put it into his mouth, and he had to talk to the police with the 22 shell and the dog excrement under his tongue and pretended that everything was all right. When we interviewed Dean, Dean tells us the same story. He said, Dad, he said, when they left, he had to spit it out. He had it in his mouth. Of course, we had that on tape from some months earlier.
That's good corroborative evidence.
It was pretty good. And I thought, maybe he copped a bit there. That's great.
Well,
shame he didn't swallow it.
Justice comes in funny ways.
But he was a truly evil man, and how those boys and the girls came out of it is beyond me, but they're decent people.
It's sad situation that people have to grow up in that type of environment, but full credit to them that they've made meaningful lives. When you were working on the investigation on Cess, did you get any information from anyone?
Oh yes, there were lots of people. We got some information through an acquaintance, and bearing in mind that Cess had many acquaintances at that time, especially in the boxing world, and they all wanted to be his mate and what have you. So it was just an acquaintance that started up with Cess.
Got the information from there.
We had a listening device attached. That person contacted police and said he's admitted to me that he murdered Alan Hall. Okay. That he did it. So that's how it all
it came forward on that basis. The interesting end to that story is that Dean actually didn't get convicted of the murder?
No, he didn't. He admitted everything, every part he had played in it, and firing the fatal shot. But it was the diminished responsibility that the jury accepted. And you've got to know the full circumstances of it. He definitely was.
And you're not uncomfortable with that decision?
I think he should have gone to jail, and I've told Dean that. However, I can totally understand how the jury came to that decision when they heard the evidence of how Cess treated those boys, and in particular Dean. Bearing in mind he was the heavyweight champion of Australia, huge big man, what have you, and there's little Cess ordering around and treating him pathetically, belittling him all the time. I mean, those boys, and they've interviewed them all, and they've cooperated and what have you. They never, at any stage at schooling, ever had kids, any of their mates back from school. They weren't allowed to have friends back. They were totally isolated from the rest of society, really.
It's frightening that kids can be caught up in that. Horror is probably the better way of describing it.
We're now going to talk about the murder of Victor Chang in 1991. Dr. Chang was a world-renowned heart surgeon who was pioneering heart transplants. Victor Chang's murder shocked the world.
It was unbelievable that. How I came about, I was taking days off that they owed me from the granny murders. 45 days they owed me. I can still remember the number. And I took it off, and I was
out fishing. Just so the public understand, I understand from the police, as in owed you. Sometimes you work when you're meant to be off. And
the budget won't allow paying.
So we get told the government's run out of money, we can't afford it, but if you don't come in, this murderer might get away. And so you had 45 days where you were told that. I had 45 days that
I had worked, I hadn't been paid for, but I was due to take them off. And I took a couple of days off. Well, I think it was the first day I took. And I was out fishing off Box Head, and we only had pages in those days. And pager come in, urgent, contact office urgent. I'm in the middle of nowhere. We didn't have mobile
So
phones.
you're out in a boat, up in the north of Sydney?
Middle of nowhere. And my mate that I was with, he did have a little transistor radio there, and we turned it on, and I said, mate, I've got to go. So we upped the lines and we're heading back, and as we're coming under the Rip Bridge, there's a news flash that there's been a murder at Mossman, believed to be an Asian man has been murdered at Mossman. That's all we had. When I got home to my place, there was a highway patrol car waiting out the front. I've been fishing. I've got bait and prawns and that. What's going on here? And
you wouldn't have looked too good or smelled too good.
I didn't smell too good either. So I had a quick shower, jumped in, and
so the highway patrol car was waiting at the front of your place to race you down
to Sydney,
an hour and a half away back to Sydney to the murder scene.
To the murder scene.
Yeah.
So got to the murder scene, and then I said, we think it's Dr. Victor Chang. I said, couldn't be Dr. Victor Chang.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and people mightn't realise, but at the time his profile was extremely high. That was cutting edge. Fiona Coote, the heart transplants.
He was probably, well, at the time they were saying he was one of the 3 top heart surgeons in the world.
Yeah.
It was just, you get your head around that. Where do we start here? And contrary to what Jaco and Waterman talk about, we didn't have anything.
Look, I think I will interrupt just a little bit. That contrary to what Jaco and Andy Waterman, I think you might be referring to your famous, infamous, whatever you want to call it, retirement function, when they perhaps were attacking you a little bit unfairly. I thought at the time I wasn't laughing at them, no. And it was your day, and it's important that you can tell your story from your perspective, how you personally solved the Victor Chang murder. And I think it was either Jaco or Andy pointed out that the offenders actually dropped their wallet at the scene.
Well, both of them did on a number of occasions. Yes, they did.
But okay, that might have given you a help in a direction, but you still solved it.
Well, Dapey here, my first reaction was, they've left it there on purpose, to throw a red herring in and we're the wrong way. So that wasn't one of my better decisions and summaries. But yes, the wallet was there. But
that's a help.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there was a big operation, as you can appreciate. We formed a task force straight away, what have you, and an offender, we had a suspect. The second man, there were 3 involved.
And look, just on the serious note too, this is probably less than 12 months after the granny killer.
Yes.
You're back in Mossman, and you've got the whole country looking at you again,
honestly,
in terms of the pressure.
Couldn't get away from the Mossman area.
Yeah.
And here we go again, and it was just as bad as the granny murders with the political pressure because of the victim, because he was such a world famous, identity. It was just on, and where do you start? And cut a long story short, we got one of the offenders, and he turned turtle straight away. And
in turning turtle, in detectives speak, that's rollover, as in he put his hands up. And
yes, but he'd only do it through indemnity, and we managed to get indemnity. We had no idea what the rest of the story was. So we got the story from him, and by that stage, we identified the second and third person. We believe we had the person down in Victoria, one of them. The third person had flown to Malaysia 2 hours earlier. We were able to track down that he'd been on a flight and gone 2 hours earlier, which unfortunately, by the time we contacted the Malaysian police, the flight had landed and he'd gone into the wilds of Malaysia, or wherever. And
but that doesn't stop our dogged detective Dennis O'Toole. And Paul Jacob.
Paul Jacob. Well, we headed off to Malaysia, and courtesy of Malaysian Airlines. We were very apprehensive, I've got to say, what was going to happen there. We were going to a Muslim country and how they operated there and how they'd receive us. At the time, there had been a fair bit of political bickering between the 2 prime ministers from Australia and Malaysia. And we thought, well, this is going to be good. And as it turned out, the police met us at the airport. There were a group of detectives there. And within 2 hours, we were totally at ease. It was as if we'd travelled interstate. They were no different to us. They operated the same as us. And we were there for, I think, about 5 or 6 weeks. And we weren't able to locate the offender, but we were sure that he was still in the country. All the borders had been closed.
Yep.
And when I talk about borders, I'm talking about as in stopping arms trafficking coming in from...
So fairly tight.
Yeah, it was tight. They were very confident he was there. We returned to Australia, put in the full reports, what had taken place, what was in place. We had they had hundreds of surveillance police and informants operating. And 2 weeks later, I got the phone call. My wife took the phone call from the superintendent in Malaysia. Evelyn, could you tell Mr. Dennis we have his man? That was the phone call. And then, of course, we had to get over there, and there was still a fair bit of politics going on between Canberra and we thought we were going to lose him, to be honest. And anyway, we made it. Evidence in the Supreme Court in Malaysia, and he was handed into our custody. And the
had some. And I know in talking to yourself and Jaco, and I'm just fascinated by life inside a Malaysian jail and so what you saw in there. And
it's if any of the prisoners in a New South Wales or an Australian jail, you go there. We went there the first time that we went to interview. Philip Lim was the offender. To interview Philip, and we took the computer in, and it was electronic. We didn't electric. We didn't have batteries, so we wanted to plug it into a PowerPoint. I said, "Well, we don't have a PowerPoint here." I said, "It's a huge jail, Pudu prison. Unfortunately, it had been used to house Australian prisoners of war during the war by the Japanese and whatever. I don't think much had changed, so we had to stop what we were doing and go to a local hardware store and buy 3 electric extension cords, where we found a PowerPoint and had it winding through the jail so that we could interview Philip. I thought, well, this is not a good start. But as it turned out, we interviewed him and extradited him, and the Malaysian Prime Minister was very, very gracious, and the Malaysian police I've got the utmost respect for, and we're still in contact.
One thing that when you were over there, you did talk about a night, or I've heard Jaco talk about a night where you went out with, let's say in Australia, I think that you'd call them a colourful racing identity, that the local police took you out drinking with, and there was someone there that seemed to have a lot of bodyguards. Paul Jacob, and without putting too much on Paul Jacob, gets very friendly when he's had a few drinks, and I think a few drinks were had on this occasion. And you relayed a story where you've got 4 people standing around this colourful racing identity who were his bodyguards, and Jaco, in his gregarious way, when he's had a few drinks, decided to cuddle them all and give them a kiss on their head, and they were reaching for their firearms.
This colourful racing identity, we christened him Lenny.
As in Lenny McPherson.
And yes, it was a funny occasion. It was absolutely... They didn't know what to do. By the time they put their hands into their coat, Jaco had actually grabbed them, was painting a kiss on the top of their heads, and I don't think we should go any further.
Okay, no diplomatic incidents.
No, it was...
But is it true, or is it fable that if you do travel interstate on investigations, as we do in homicide quite often, that the interstate police tend to look after you? And that's not just look after you for the type of work that you're doing and help you around finding the suspects or witnesses, but also on a social side, they'll take you out and take you out for a drink and that. So when you're talking interstate, and I think that translates when you go overseas to Malaysia.
Look, it was exactly the same. We didn't know what to expect, and as it turned out, they could have been in New South Wales.
Yeah.
And even to the extent after we'd finished all the proceedings, the extradition had been approved, we were booked to go on a flight to return to Sydney the following day, and I can talk about it now. And there was a reception, afternoon tea, we only had tea, and it was the Malaysian Prime Minister and thanked us, and I thanked him for the support and the cooperation of the Royal Malaysia Police. And I happened to mention that we were flying out the next day, and his response was, nonsense, you see Malaysia first, we show you Malaysia first.
It's hard to argue with the Prime Minister.
Well, he's the Prime Minister. And Jimmy Council, the tip, was in charge of the task force, and I told him, you're not going to believe this, boss. And Jimmy said, I don't believe anything you say, Miles. He said, but run it past me anyway.
There's some plenty of excuses for detectives saying why they've got to stay on the trip longer, but when the Malaysian Prime Minister has insisted, that's a pretty good one. And there was also, as is, because you and Jake are friendly people, and you invited if your counterparts came to Australia to visit at any time. Is it true, the story that Jake tells, that at one stage a busload of people from Malaysia turned up and JK didn't recognise any of them and they were at his place?
And a little bit further, because we had ordered a huge cook-up. Jake had done it all himself. Yeah. He and his charming wife, Debbie, had prepared fried rice, and they put bacon in the fried rice. So an hour before this busload arrived, Evelyn, my wife, myself, Jaco and Debbie are picking out bacon for religious reasons, and we didn't mean to offend them. We weren't going to throw the whole lot out. That's all we had to eat. And that was funny. And they were the wrong people. They were friends of friends of friends.
So we
didn't know any of them.
The people that came over you didn't even know. But in true Miles and Jaco manner, I'm sure they had a great time.
Look, it's, I've been so fortunate, truly. All I can say is I loved it. Anybody that joins the police and goes into homicide for all the right reasons, and they want to do that, you certainly you have to put up with some horrendous scenes and what have you, and terrible human tragedy. No doubt about that. But to make some good, you've got to be there and being committed to stopping these people doing it. It's going to happen. It's going to happen again. Yeah. All you can do is try and prevent it happening again by finding the person, arresting and putting them away. And it's got to be done properly, of course. Yeah.
Well, knowing the career that you've had and the way that you've turned out, and the view, you haven't got a slanted view on life either. You still see the positives, even seeing all the negatives, and full credit to you. But I'm not going to let you get away from an interview without asking you some questions, some difficult questions.
Now, you didn't tell me this. Is this time for official caution?
I'll tell you when I'm going to caution you. You know you're not under arrest at this stage, but...
I'm looking at that door.
Okay. I'm looking at one of your partners, Barry Keeling, sitting over there. Yeah. And I'm going to ask you the hard questions. Who's the better detective, Barry or Jaco?
No, Kilo was outstanding.
Okay.
Who's Jaco?
Great. I've got that. That's all I want from this interview. I'm going to take that to Jaco. Look, Miles, thank you so much for your time. You entertain me every time I sit down and have a chat with you. Stories could go on forever,
but not being recorded.
But Miles, don't make jokes about recording. It's not funny for some of us.
Low blow. Okay.
Let me finish off a question that we finish off with all the guests on the Real Detectives podcast. There's a lot of detectives portrayed in fiction, in books, movies, TV. Who do you most identify with, fictional detective?
Fictional?
Yeah.
I think I mentioned it before. I would suggest probably the one of the most famous detectives of all in that, with your James Bonds and all that. I'll go for Danny DeVito.
I reckon you have dead set nailed it. I reckon.
I'm joking.
Sorry. Well, you've nailed it.
When they were talking about the grannies, they were talking about the offender who would play some of the roles if ever it was made into a film. And Ronnie Smith said they'd make John Wayne Glover, it'd be ideal, Clint Eastwood.
Yeah.
And Miles, Danny DeVito.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Well, thanks, Miles. You've taught me a lot. I've worked under you. The lineage that you passed on has been passed on to me. I really appreciate it, and thanks for your time.
I understand that, and mate, I'm very proud of you, like everybody else that's had any dealings with you, mate. And your loss to the people of New South Wales, I think, is pretty grievous, mate. I just hope that there's still some people left there that have got your attitude, and it hasn't gone with you. That's all.
Yeah.
What a terrible shame to end a career like yours under these circumstances.
Yeah. Well, we'd like to think we all leave a legacy. I know you certainly have, and I'd like to think I have. So.
You have to, mate.
Yeah.
You have to. Let's hope that everything turns out all right, and I wish you all the best, mate.
Beautiful. Okay. Thanks, Miles. Cheers.
See you, mate.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I always feel good after spending time with Dennis, or Miles as his mates call him. That's a trait that he brought to his work as a homicide detective, and the reason he was successful. He made people feel comfortable, and they revealed things to him because of that. However, those that mistook his happy-go-lucky nature for weakness did so at their own peril. He was strong when he needed to be, and a man of true integrity, one of nature's true gentlemen. Cheers. Next week on I Catch Killers, I'm speaking to retired Detective Chief Inspector Angelo Momolo, an absolute legend of the New South Wales Police. We'll be talking to Angelo about his time working in Redfern during the riots, also as a young detective in the Armed Hold-Up Squad. His work that he carried out with Middle Eastern organised crime gangs, some fascinating murder investigations, and of course the leadership of the investigation into the Lint Cafe siege. I Catch Killers is published by True Crime Australia. Produced by Claire Harvey from the Sunday Telegraph and Dylan Adams at Made in Katana. I'm now an investigative journalist at News Corp Australia, attached to the Sunday Telegraph. If you like the podcast, please subscribe to our newspapers.